Welcome back to DemystifySci. I'm Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
This is the podcast where we search for theories and ideas that are going to change the world.
Today on the podcast, we are talking to Eric Cline, professor of archaeology and ancient history at George Washington University, about the apocalypse that was survived by our ancestors. The apocalypse in question is the end of the Bronze Age. Prior to about 1100 BC, there was a flourishing network of empires in the Mediterranean that were all connected to each other, trading well and relatively wealthy. Then, around 1177 BC, the title of Eric's book series, things started to radically change. The empires fell into disrepair, there were takeovers, there were invasions, and then on the other side of the collapse, a new set of empires rose. This is the first official conversation that we're hosting on the Bronze Age, and the reason that we're hosting these conversations is because we want to understand the through line that stretches all the way back from the present day to this moment of the earliest civilizations, the cultures that figured out large-scale trade, manufacturing, metallurgy, and managed to spread it not only between themselves, but throughout the wider world. And we hope that by understanding why it is that they fell apart and who it was that survived the collapse, we might actually be able to learn something about the present day to ensure that the world around us doesn't fall apart in the same way that it did at the end of the Bronze Age.
Remember, guys, we don't have sponsors here. We don't paste advertisements all over our podcasts, but that means we need you to support this project. You can do that a number of different ways. We have some merch for sale that we've designed ourselves down on the shelf. We've also got a music album, which we'll play you a little piece of as we lead into the conversation. And we've got an upcoming book called Paradox Lost, where we explore the loss of material mediators in fundamental physics. So if any of those sound interesting to you, check it out and keep this project going.
All right, enjoy the conversation with archaeologist and ancient historian Eric Cline of George Washington University, and we will see you next time.
I think a really good place to begin is just maybe if you could very briefly introduce yourself and what it is that, how you would describe what it is that you study. What do you call it?
Okay. Well, that's starting off with a big question there. But all right, so I'm Eric Cline. I teach at George Washington University. And I would say I'm an archaeologist and an ancient historian. The two go hand in hand, and I've got degrees in both. So as for what I do, I would have told you a decade or more ago that I do international relations and trade 3,000 years ago or 3,500 years ago, because I'm interested in the contacts back then. I've always said that you can't investigate or understand ancient Greece in isolation. Similarly, you can't really understand Egypt in isolation or anybody else in the late Bronze Age. So I, from the get-go, from my dissertation onward, was looking at the interconnections and everything that went with that, from commercial to diplomatic to marital to whatever. And then over the years, especially the last 10 years, I was asked to dive down and focus on the end of the late Bronze Age, and in particular, the causes for it, the collapse, if you will. And so, totally unintentionally, I have found myself as one of the spokesmen for what happened 3,200 years ago, what caused the collapse in the Mediterranean, and might there be any lessons for us today? So I've gone from the large to the very specific and narrow.
Well, that really intersects with our interests, because I think what brings us to this is we're so curious about who our ancestors were. And I don't mean our DNA necessarily. I mean, we live in a culture that has some thread which goes all the way back to the Bronze Age and the Mediterranean. You know, the things that I find myself really valuing about our shared culture in the West today, you know, science, Republican democracy, things like this can be traced kind of back through ancient Greece. And eventually you're going to find yourself at this weird, interconnected civilization. I don't know, maybe that's not the right word, civilization, but there's some people that are foundational to a lot of these threads that we find in the world today. I mean, even our Capitol building basically looks like a Greek temple, right? I mean, this isn't an accident.
What we want to get is a sense of who managed to make it through. Because you are so well known for your conversations about collapse. You know, the number of views that you get for these lectures on the end of the Bronze Age is stunning to me, because I feel like it reveals some kind of deep fascination with not just ancient culture, but also what it means for the world to end, for apocalypse to happen, and then for somebody to survive. Because as you make the case in After 1177, the megalithic, or not megalithic, but the large-scale projects fall apart on a cultural sense, but those people kind of keep going and they reconsolidate into new nations, and everything just continues. And that's a weird thing, because we feel like when the world ends and nothing is there, and all of these people are gone and scattered to the wind and the earth is salted. But that's not really true. And so it would be really cool to get a sense of who were the people before the collapse that were planting the seeds of their success for after everything fell apart, and that managed to survive and managed to flourish. And so I think that Shiloh led us to the very edge of this. And so, because you list several civilizations in 1177 that are the main players. And so who are those main players?
So, great questions. Good beginning. This is going to be an interesting discussion. I would start by taking even a step back from that, but not too far back. Because as you were just saying, a lot of what we've got around today has come down to us from those societies. Right? So we talk about the Greeks and Romans especially, but Mesopotamia and Egypt were just as beholden to them, even if the vast majority of people out there don't realize it. Right? We always talk about Greece and Rome, but Hammurabi, the lawgiver, comes from Mesopotamia, right? We've got all these pictures up. I saw some the other day from the Supreme Court here in D.C., and they've got the pictures of all the lawgivers, and Hammurabi is up there. So anyway, we owe a lot to the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Mesopotamians, even the Sumerians, the Hittites, in addition to Greece and Rome and the Phoenicians and everybody else. So without going too far back, I think we can just concentrate on the second millennium BC, which would get us back again to about 3500 BC. We can leave out the Sumerians, even though they gave us the base 60 system, from which we still have hours and minutes and 360 degrees in a circle and all that. And we get the Epic of Gilgamesh coming ultimately from them. We get the flood story. I mean, we've got a lot of stuff that we could go back to. But what I concentrated on in 1177 BC and then after 1177 were the societies that we find in the late Bronze Age, as opposed to the early or the middle. I mean, the Bronze Age in the Mediterranean and Near East as a whole goes from about 3000 BC down to 1000 BC. Right? And I've been concentrating my entire career on the last part, from 1700 or 1500 BC, which means that I'm mostly looking into the Mycenaeans on mainland Greece, the Minoans on Crete, the Hittites in Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, the Canaanites, who would be up and down the Levant and what is today mostly Syria, Lebanon, Israel, down into Gaza and the Sinai. They've got the Egyptians in Egypt, got the Assyrians and Babylonians in Mesopotamia, today Iraq, and then a group that most people have never heard of, the Mitanni, that are in what is today northern Syria. So this is like 8 or 9 societies, and for ease in my lectures, I usually refer to them as the G8 of the ancient late Bronze Age, because that's something modern
true,
people
yeah.
can relate to, because we talk about the G7, the G8, the G20. So it gives them a mental picture. And sure enough, those societies, the big ones back then, were interacting much like the G7 and G8 are today. But bear in mind that we're really only talking about from Italy over to Afghanistan and from Turkey down to Egypt in modern terms. That's the area we're talking about. We're not pulling in China. We're not even pulling in India. This is the area that was on an interconnected basis on a daily, weekly basis.
Now,
So,
I've actually found that turns out to be something of a controversial perspective with normal people that I talk to, and I wouldn't have thought that before digging into this. But it seems like the idea that these were sort of isolated civilizations with their own cultures that didn't touch one another is more prevalent than I would have thought. Because for me, it just seems second nature that, of course, everybody's interacting with their neighbors, and there's plenty of material records for trade across vast distances. But it seems like, why is that such a prevalent background worldview that people have come to understood these as being isolated groups?
because that's the way they're usually taught and written about. I mean, in academia, as you well know, everybody's got their own little niche. And, they're like, oh, I do Egypt. I can't possibly talk about the Hittites. That's not what I do, right? And people write books, a book on not just Egypt, but New Kingdom Egypt, or even King Tut. You get down to a single pharaoh. Or they write a book about the Hittites or their successors, the Neo-Hittites. But the number of books that are written about interactions between them are few and far between, I would say. So your average person on the street, average college graduate, will have had a course such as we teach at GW, the history of ancient Greece, boom. The history of ancient Rome, boom. You might get one like I teach, Egypt and the ancient Near East, and that covers quite a bit, but the overlap with Greece and with Rome comes in one lecture, maybe 2, for the most part. So they're taught separately, and that's why I think the vast majority of people know them as separate and think they're isolated. And even if they've done further reading in the rest of their lives, they're usually reading a specific book on something. So it used to be, it's gotten better now, but it used to be that I could count the number of people that talked about the interconnections of the ancient society during the Bronze Age. I could count them on one hand. Now there's a little bit more than that. But yeah, it comes as a shock to a lot of people when I start out my lectures or the books, and I just say, they were as interconnected back then as we are today. And they're like, wait, what? There's no way. And I'm like,
And
no, no, no.
that's
Yeah.
what makes them seem like ancestors to me in some way. Like the more that I study this period of time, the more similar I feel. Like the less ancient they feel to me in some ways. I feel like what they set up, the fact that you said you got into this because of international trade, is really at the foundation of this. I mean, these people had figured out how to get the goods from one side of the world to the other, the known world to them, right? I mean, they were very much pulling off something not as dissimilar as it seems from the world of Amazon delivery, right? They had it figured out in their own way, In some sense, it makes them very near and real to me.
Yeah,
And
I absolutely agree with everything you've just said. In these last couple of books, I've said basically there's nothing new under the sun. They were more similar to us than one might suspect, and I actually laid it out a bit. I think in one paragraph I said they had amazing marriages. Think of Diana and, the more recent British marriages. They also had nasty, nasty, nasty divorces, right, which went on for years before they were finalized. They had economic embargoes. They had embassies. I mean, they had basically everything that we've got. And as it turns out, they had, supply chain issues as well. They had climate change problems. They had pandemics. They had disease that ravaged them. So I would almost say literally nothing that we've got today would surprise them. They're like, oh yeah, we had our version of that, right? Whereas we are surprised going the other way. And the other thing that I find is a lot of people do not realize how sophisticated they were back then in the ancient world. I mean, they we got nothing on them basically for their time. They were amazing. We've got more technology today and a couple of thousand more years of learning, but you go back and you look at the Pythagorean theorem and then the antecedents to that, in Egypt and maybe in Mesopotamia and all that. You're like, oh, okay. They were pretty advanced, which is why I made the point that when all of this went down, when everything kind of collapsed, we lost a lot. And we had to start over again in many ways. But I also said, I think this was in the first edition of the first book, the one that came out in 2014, I ended it by saying something like, sometimes you need a wildfire to clear away the old growth and make room for new trees and new thinking. I think I might have taken that out in the revised version that came out in 2021 because that seemed a little harsh, and I got a little bit of pushback from the general public. What do you mean the wildfire is good? I'm like, look, sometimes it is, but
not promoting bloody revolution. Don't worry.
No, and not even promoting wildfires. Like, don't go out and set them. But you get the point. So it was not terrible that they had to start over because that got new things going, like the alphabet and eventually democracy. But we did lose quite a bit when things went down.
How about we take a look at some of these individual people? I mean, I have my favorites personally, but we should explore some of them. I think in some sense, the inland empires like Egypt and Mesopotamia are, with their monumental architecture and so forth, are the easiest to understand and perhaps the ones that people are most familiar with. These kind of seafaring or Mediterranean peoples are a little bit more, what would we say?
Nebulous?
Nebulous, that's a good word. Thank you. Yeah, so the Minoans, we will connect to the Mycenaeans as well, and then maybe eventually the Phoenicians, the Canaanite people too. Who are some of these people that folks might not have really come across in their history books?
Oh, again, it depends on their training in high school and in college. So definitely the Mycenaeans are known to most people from mainland Greece because they've either read the Iliad and the Odyssey, they know about the Trojan War, they saw the Brad Pitt movie from 2004, right? They think they know the Mycenaeans. The Minoans on Crete, again, they would probably think they knew of them because you've got King Minos and you've got the the Greek mythology, like with the story of Theseus and the Minotaur, where he goes down into the maze and fights against the half bull, half man. We know these things from Greek mythology, from the stories, the legends.
And they were directly prior to the Mycenaeans, right? Just to give some order to these events.
Well, no, I mean, they are the Mycenaeans and
They
the
are the
Minoans. You're talking about
Mycenaeans.
the Minoans. The Minoans are slightly earlier. Yeah, let's put it that way. They're end of the third millennium into the second millennium, from say 2200 BC on, roughly speaking. The Mycenaeans really appear on the scene about 1700 BC. So, but in the grand scheme of things, they're both 3,000, 4,000 years old. But people will frequently get Minoans and Mycenaeans as part of either a Greek history course, if they start in the Bronze Age, or a classical mythology course, because they're taught about it there. But very rarely are people taught about the Hittites from ancient Anatolia, even though they are absolutely phenomenal, fabulous, really interesting people. If they've heard about the Canaanites, it's because they went to Sunday school or Hebrew school and they learned about the Bible stories in which the Canaanites would figure. Egypt, of course, everybody's heard of. I mean, kind of hard to avoid Egypt and King Tut. You have to be living in a cave, I would say, not to know about that. But Assyrians and Babylonians, I think I'd be lucky if somebody had heard of Hammurabi or the Epic of Gilgamesh. So there is a whole spectrum, shall we say, where people have heard of some and not at all of others. So the question is, like, that I had in my books is, how much do I explain the background? Without, I tried to jump right into what was happening in the late Bronze Age, but I'm like, can't do that. And so I have flashbacks into things like, who are the Hittites? Who are the Minoans? And then also additional flashbacks. How did we discover them? Who discovered them? Who were the archaeologists? Bearing in mind that each of those could be and has been its own book in itself. So, there's a fine line there where, yes, I wanted to talk about what collapsed and get people to understand how important it was to know what these people were and what they had done, and then what we lost when they went away. But at the same time, with 100,000 word limit tops, there's a limit to what I could do. So it really is bits and pieces. And what I really wanted to do, and I think I do from time to time in the footnotes, is, hello, we've only just touched on this. If you're interested, here's a couple other books to go read. All right. So I did toss that in.
I mean, I want to circle back to the Trojan War that you were talking about, because in some ways, the classic Greeks that give us these mythologies are pointing to something that happened in the past. And of course, famously, Troy was eventually discovered. And you mentioned that the sort of Greek heroes in that story could be pinned to the Mycenaeans. Were the Trojans? Which of the G8 would you pin the Trojans to?
Well, okay, we've got the G8, but then we've got the lesser, the G12, the G16, something like that. And I would put the Trojans in that second tier. They are important. Troy was an incredibly important port city because it controlled the trade up to the Black Sea, but they're not on an equivalent level to the Egyptians and the Hittites, or even the Mycenaeans or Minoans, I would argue. In fact, I think, and a lot of other people would agree, I'm not saying anything new here, that the Trojans may have been vassals to the Hittites, because the Hittites, who are ruling from central Anatolia, like over by Ankara today, they eventually capture all of Anatolia, including the west coast. And Troy would have fallen into that, and it would have been important to the Hittites. So, in fact, I think they called Troy Wilusa, which is actually quite close to the Greek word for the city, because we know it as Troy, but we also know it as Ilios, right? That's where we get the Iliad from. And Ilios, though, was originally spelled with a digamma. It had a W at the beginning, but digammas drop out over time in ancient Greek. And so I think the Greeks originally knew it as Wilios, which is really close to Wilusa for the Hittites.
Hmm.
So I've actually suggested, I don't know if I actually said it in one of the books or in my scholarly articles, but I've suggested that the Trojan War was in fact a battle over a contested periphery, that the Mycenaeans were expanding over to the western coast of Anatolia, and the Hittites were expanding to the western coast of Anatolia. So all those cities up and down the western coast would have been in a contested periphery. And we actually see this continue over time. I mean, you eventually get the Ionian cities in that same region in the first millennium. So I do not believe, I'm afraid, that the Trojan War was fought because of Helen. I think it was fought, like Agamemnon says in the 2004 movie, it's fought for the same reasons all wars are fought: land, trade, possession, money, loot, all of that. And so I do think the Trojan War happened. I think something happened. It's not quite the way that Homer described it, but the Hittites talk about 4 different wars being fought for Wilusa during the same time period. So I think we've actually only got the Greek side of things, and that there might have been a Hittite side. And there's, in fact, indications. We've got a line or two in other texts quoting from what might be a Hittite version of the Iliad, which is kind of cool. So, anyway, I do think that there is a kernel of truth at the basis of what we read about with the Trojan War, but not quite the way that Homer did it, because Homer consolidating everything is still 500 years later, and it doesn't even get written down for another 100 years or more after Homer. So they're really remembering centuries back. And this is what frequently happens when you get a systems collapse, which is what I think happens at the end of the late Bronze Age. In the centuries afterward, people look back at what they see now as a disappeared golden age with heroes and everything else. And I think that's really what we've got here. So I do think there's a kernel of truth, but I would not take it at face value because it's stories handed down for hundreds of years. I mean, think back 600 years from us today. What would we write about that happened 600? It'd be back in the 1500s. You know, you're going to make up an epic about that and have it absolutely factually correct? Probably not. So there's
Shakespeare.
that.
Well,
Yeah.
there's a really interesting piece of this, which is that multiple times in 1177, you mentioned that the trade was often conducted in Akkadian. And so
Writing about it, yes. Mhm.
and so the lingua I've read that the lingua franca of
Mhm.
trade in the Eastern Mediterranean was Akkadian.
Mhm. Yep.
But I can't find any evidence that similar Akkadian descriptions of trade were found in Mycenaean or Minoan areas. And you also
Oh.
mention that the
Mhm.
Hittites have this, you call it the world's first embargo, where don't they say that you're not allowed to trade with both them and the Mycenaeans at the same time?
Yes. Yes. All right. So that's a lot to unpack right there. So let me work backwards. Okay. So there is a very interesting text. It's a treaty that the Hittites, the king Tutaliya IV, one of my favorite names, who is ruling about 1250 BC. He signs a treaty with a guy named Shaushagumuru. I mean, these are wonderful names for pets and goldfish, and I'm not sure I would name a kid Shaushagumuru, but and Shaushagumuru was a king of a place called Amuru, which is basically in North Syria, south of the port city of Ugarit. And the Hittites and Amuru had been vassal master for a while by this point. So in this treaty is mentioned an entity, a political entity named Ahiawa, which I discuss in the book to a certain degree, because Ahiawa is thought by many of us to be the Achaeans. In other words, the Mycenaeans. Right? Homer calls the Mycenaeans the Achaeans, the Danaans. He's got a couple names for them. And Achaea is similar to Ahiawa. So it's not 100% sure, but I think it's a pretty good given. And in this treaty between the Hittites and Amuru, at one point it says, "Let no ship of Ahiawa go to him." And him is the king of Assyria in inland Mesopotamia. In other words, an Ahiawan ship would pull up to the shore of Amuru and unload its goods, and this treaty said, you can't then let any of the goods or the people go on inland into Assyria, because the Hittites were fighting against the Assyrians at that time. So that is one type of embargo, let's put it that way, which is kind of interesting. What's even more interesting is that in that exact same text, that same treaty, round about 1250 BC or so, there is a list of kings and their countries or their areas. And it says, the king of Babylon, the king of Assyria, the king of Egypt, the king of Ahiawa. But there is a line drawn through the king of Ahiawa. On the actual clay tablet, they crossed it out, which leads us to wonder all kinds of things, like, why'd you cross it out? Why didn't you just rewrite it? It looks like a rough draft. But also, why did you cross it out? What happened to the king of Ahiawa? Well, the thinking has been that if those are the Achaeans, the Mycenaeans, maybe something happened to them, and that they were not among the great powers, the G4, if you will, right? Assyria, Babylonia, Egypt, Hittites, and it was the Mycenaeans, but not anymore. But we don't have any explanation. There's no little pencil note saying, this is why I crossed it out. We just don't know. So that one text gives us evidence for basically an embargo against the Assyrians, but also a question mark about why Ahiawa suddenly seems to have been crossed out. But we also have another set of data completely differently, which I factor into this as well, because if you look along the coast of Anatolia, right, modern day Turkey, you will find Mycenaean pottery all along the western coast and the southern coast. But you will not find Mycenaean pottery in inland Anatolia, up by the Hittite capital. So one of the things I was asking is, well, do we have the reverse? Is there Hittite stuff in Greece? And the answer there is no, not much. Maybe a half a dozen objects, which is nothing. But in both areas, up in inland Anatolia and on mainland Greece, we have literally dozens, hundreds of artifacts from Egypt and Cyprus and Canaan, everybody else, except for this kind of glaring omission. And so in an article long ago, 1990, 91, when I was just getting started, I asked the question, why are we missing Mycenaean objects in Hittite territory and Hittite objects in Mycenaean territory? And I suggested that maybe there was an embargo in place, and that perhaps it was because they were fighting over Troy. And I had actually suggested there that the Trojan War might not have really been between the Mycenaeans and the Trojans, but it was actually between the Mycenaeans and the Hittites over control of Troy, like we kind of inferred a couple of minutes ago. In which case, if they're fighting over the city, they're not about to trade with each other. So already, that's almost 40 years ago, I put out this idea that maybe there was an embargo, and I waited and waited and waited for somebody to come up with evidence that I was wrong and to say, no, no, no. And while there have been a couple from time to time that have just said, I don't know if I agree with that, it's never been countered, at least to my satisfaction. So I do think, therefore, we have both archaeological evidence for an embargo, and we have textual evidence for a different embargo, which I think is kind of interesting. We've got other evidence for embassies and all that, but in terms of embargoes, like we do today, they had them back then. And I think we've got evidence from a couple of different viewpoints.
It also, it kind of hints at there perhaps having been a shift in the culture in the ancient Greek regions. Like, if you think about the Mycenaeans and the Minoans as the same peoples, you mentioned this earlier, in some sense, there's a continuum, but the Mycenaeans seem much more preoccupied with fortresses and battle and war and all of that compared to of course, we have very little material record of who these Minoan people were. It's very difficult to tell, but they don't seem to have had a standing army from what I can gather. And I wonder if there wasn't a cultural shift in some sense. I'm not going to say like a military coup, but like something shifted, and maybe those people became less popular afterwards because they all of a sudden presented a new threat that they weren't presenting before, or it was more diplomatic in the Minoan period. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you're touching on some of the themes that are frequently taught in the courses. The Minoans are usually presented as much more peaceful, non-militaristic, more open to trade, if you will. And their palaces, their centers, are more eco-friendly, if you want. Again, it's more like today, but the palace at Knossos, where King Minos is supposed to be, blends right into the landscape. Any architect today would be like, yeah, I wanted it to be a part of the landscape. But it's also open, it's light, it's airy, there are light wells coming in, and there are no fortification walls. And you're right, we don't have any evidence for standing armies. So the Minoans are usually presented as peaceful. In fact, back in the 60s, I tell my students they were presented as basically peaceful, barefoot hippies, if you will, at one with
very rich
nature.
Hippies, though, yeah, with the BMWs and stuff. They're very rich hippies, yeah.
Yes, exactly. But the Mycenaeans, on the other hand, yes, they have forts. They have fortification walls. Their palaces are dark and smoky, and they look inward as opposed to outward for the Minoans, and they're militaristic. So we usually compare and contrast the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, and we even say they're different ethnicities, if you will. We're not actually sure where the Minoans come from. It might be from Anatolia way back when, whereas the Greeks, the Mycenaeans, may have come down from the north, from the Balkans, or whatever. But, this is where DNA is going to help us out. But in the Minoan period, Yeah, they seem to be more peacefully trading, especially with Egypt. We get a lot of inferences of trade between the Minoans and the Egyptians, like from the time of Hatshepsut in the 15th century on. Whereas the Mycenaeans, although they are trading with people, they are also more militaristic. We see wall paintings with warriors marching off, rather than just trading. So there is a difference between them. But we're also talking about different periods within the second millennium, Minoans being earlier, 19th, 18th, 17th centuries, and Mycenaeans, 17th, 16th, 15th. And actually, the Mycenaeans eventually take over Crete by probably 1350 BC, maybe even 1450 BC. The Mycenaeans take over, and the last phase of the palace at Knossos on Crete is seen as Mycenaean rather than Minoan. And the style of the paintings on the walls change, style of the burials change, we get more weapons and so on. So it does look like the Mycenaeans invaded Crete towards the end. So lots going on here. But in part, that's why it's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this transformation is fascinating, especially when you bring the Hittites in. So, were the Hittites interacting with the Minoans, or was there some antecedent civilization that we might use a better name for in that region?
Far as we can tell, and I've been looking for this, it doesn't seem that the Hittites and the Minoans interact. There is maybe a smattering of Minoan pottery up in Anatolia, but I would say that's probably indirect. We don't have many Hittite objects on Crete. So, but there I don't think it's deliberate. I just think they're not trading. There's really no need to. And the Minoans are more focused down to Egypt and across to Canaan rather than kind of up north. So I don't think we've got that much of a connection. Though it is interesting if the Minoans do hark back at some point earlier and came from Anatolia, it's interesting that the links didn't keep up. But again, that's not at all sure. And I'm sure even some of my colleagues who are listening to this are probably shaking their heads going, no, 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 that's not what we think anymore. That's so, 2000 or 1990s. But we definitely, in terms of international trade and connections, it's hard to find anything with the Minoans and the Hittites. Just as a contrast, briefly, the Egyptians have a name for the Minoans. They call them the Keftiu. That's the name for both the island of Crete and the Minoans. So the Egyptians call them Keftiu. The Canaanites and Mesopotamia call them Kaftor, Capphtor, Kaftor as the island, and Kaftorians as the Minoans. And they mention them in terms of trade and embassies and such. Whereas the Hittites don't seem to have a name for the Minoans, at least as far as I can recall. And until recently, it was thought that they didn't refer to them. Even the Mycenaeans. I talked about the Achiawa. There's, I don't know, maybe 20-something texts that have been published. We actually put out a book a decade ago or so, I and a couple of colleagues, on the Achiawan texts, all the texts that the Hittites mention Achiawa, because they had been published previously, mostly in German, some in English, and so we wanted to get them all out there for the English readers. So we've got the Hittites referring to the Mycenaeans, but not necessarily to the Minoans, at least as far as we know so far.
Like, what did the Minoans offer the Egyptians, right? They're this island in the middle of the Mediterranean. Are they connecting raw goods from the other side of the Mediterranean? Or like, why are they, first of all, yeah, why are they even showing up in Egypt? Why are they important? And how did they get so rich?
Well,
Rich hippies.
Yeah, rich hippies. There you go. All right, you got to define how wealthy is wealthy.
Mm.
Um, Look, it's not just the Minoans; it's everybody here. They're trading raw materials as well as finished goods. So you've got tin going around, copper, silver, gold, and each of the different civilizations has, I wouldn't say necessarily a monopoly, but the upper hand. So the gold is coming from Egypt because they're controlling Nubia, the Sudan, the Eastern Desert, where the gold is coming from at that time. Tin is most likely from Central Asia, Afghanistan, though there is some evidence from Eastern Turkey that some came from there. And very recently, there's some evidence that there may have been some tin coming from Cornwall, especially towards the end of the late Bronze Age. But I think the vast majority comes from Afghanistan. And we have Mesopotamian texts that talk about tin coming to Mari on the Euphrates and then going from there to Ugarit on the coast of Syria. And then from there to Kaftor. It says that tin went to Crete and that there were
That seems
Minoan
way out of the
merchants.
way. That's so wild. Like, why would you go all the way to the middle of the Mediterranean with your Afghanistan tin? It's so crazy.
Well, because they're paying for it. I mean, you remember you need tin to make bronze, right? 10% tin, 90% copper, as I say in all my lectures. You need that to make bronze. So, but it's also not very likely that the people from Afghanistan brought it all the way there. It's going to be what we call down the line trading. You know, it's going to go from place to place to place, and each middleman is going to up the price and take their cut of the profit until when it gets to Crete, it's worth a king's ransom and all that. So tin's going to come from those places. Cyprus is probably where most of the copper comes from. And silver, we've got the Lavrian mines outside of Athens and so on. But we have texts, especially Mari, the city that I just mentioned on the Euphrates. There is an archive from the time of around Hammurabi, 1800 BC, give or take. And in that archive, it talks about goods coming from Crete. And it talks, for instance, about finished goods. There's a mention of a gold dagger inlaid with lapis lazuli, which must have been gorgeous. It also talks about a pair of Kaftorian leather shoes, which are probably either boots or sandals, that made their way all the way to Babylon and were given to Hammurabi, but which he returned. And I've always wondered why he returned them. And I make a joke in my lectures, are they too last millennium? Didn't he know about regifting? And in fact, 1177 BC, the original title was Hammurabi's Shoes. I thought that was going to be a perfect title for a book about international trade. And that was what I originally pitched to Princeton, was a book not about the collapse, but about the trade and interconnections. And so Hammurabi's Shoes was a perfect title. But then when Rob Tempio said he wanted more on the collapse, he then suggested 1177 BC. So anyway, they're trading finished goods as well as raw materials. In among, I don't know, are they raw materials or are they finished goods? I would say wine is included, perfume is included, olive oil is included, right? And yeah, those are finished goods in a way, because you got to make the wine, you got to make the olive oil, but they're also raw materials. So in addition, there's also wheat and barley and grain. So some of these, the Minoans were able to trade. And others they imported. So it's back and forth. And in a number of cases, it's like coals to Newcastle. Yeah, we already make our own olive oil, but I like yours too. So let me import it, even though I've already got it. So, and that's kind of where the Hittites come in, because They didn't have olive trees up there. They had to import olive oil. But anyway, so this is why I say the interconnections were so important, because each of these societies is not self-sufficient. They are dependent on the others. And I think that's in part why when one went down, most of the others followed suit, because they were not self-sufficient. So again, lessons for today, I think.
Hmm. So I have a decent map of most of the areas we're talking about, but for me, Cyprus is still a little bit mysterious.
Mhm.
Who's on Cyprus? Because I know that there's the Cypro-Minoan script, which is a descendant of the undeciphered Linear A that's found on
Possibly.
Cyprus.
Right.
Possibly.
Possibly.
All right, we'll give you
Right.
that. But so, I mean, I guess with an undeciphered language, it's difficult to make any true connections. But
Mhm.
so, is it the Minoans that are hanging out on Cyprus? Is it some amalgamation of many different people? Is Cyprus sort of
Yeah, like
in
if the Minoans
play?
if they controlled those copper mines, it would explain why they were so rich.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm still, and I don't totally understand. So who is there?
Let's keep Cyprus for the Cypriots.
Hmm.
This has been vastly discussed over the last couple of decades. And for the longest time, it was suggested that waves of invaders had occupied Cyprus, bringing their culture with them, including the Mycenaeans, who were seen at one point as not just one wave, but two different waves overrunning Cyprus. Now, there may well have been immigrants to Cyprus that were bringing different aspects of different cultures, but I would go with there's an indigenous group of people there that, who knows where they came from originally, but the Cypriots have their own society, their own culture. They are a melting pot. You will see all kinds of influences from Egypt, from Minoans, from Mycenaeans, from Canaanites, even from Hittites. And after the fall, we get lots of impact from the Phoenicians, for example. But Cyprus, it's the Cypriots. They're their own people. And Cypro-Minoan, yeah, it might be related to some of the other writing systems elsewhere, but it seems to be unique. I wouldn't say unique to Cyprus because it's found elsewhere as well, but everywhere else it's found, it's inscribed on jars that were either coming from Cyprus or being sent to Cyprus or other objects like that. I'm thinking of some of the jars that have been found at the site of Tiryns on mainland Greece, which have Cypro-Minoan signs on the handles.
Hmm.
And the debates rage. Were there Cypriots living at Tiryns? Like, was there an enclave of merchants there? Or is this wine that's being put into jugs to be sent to Cyprus? And they are labeling it with a Cypro-Minoan sign that would be readable to somebody on Cyprus. I mean, we honestly don't know what's going on. And depending on which author, which scholar, which book you read, you will get different interpretations. You will get different statements, sometimes made as fact and sometimes presented as hypotheses. But the pendulum has swung, I would say, all the way back to seeing the Cypriots as their own indigenous group that are impacted by others, but not that Cyprus is invaded again and again and again and is the result of multiple influences by people settling down. So, but again, if you had asked me that same question in 1960 or 1970, I would have given you a completely different answer, probably involving waves of invading Mycenaeans or Mycenaeans fleeing the collapse of their own society and settling down. So it's still an open question. And again, depending on who you read, you will get different interpretations.
Do they have a palatial culture? Do they have these large scale works? Do they seem as rich as their partners, or do they seem differently organized?
I would say they're similar.
Hmm.
Whether that's superficial, I wouldn't say, but yeah, we don't have like the fortified palaces like we do on mainland Greece, but we also don't have the undefended hippie communes of Crete. It's something in between. We've got port cities, Enkomi and others, Hala Sultan Teke. We've got obviously rich settlements like Ios Demetrios, that's the modern name for it. They're definitely well off. And in their case, they're probably making their wealth off of copper because they are the main resource for shipping copper to everybody else. And
What is the architectural stylings? Is it closer to Crete or closer to Canaan or to Turkey? Like, how would you describe these compared to Knossos or
well,
I mean, obviously, we like the Mycenaean
again,
structures are basically Mordor. Uh,
I would say they're unique in their own way, but there are certainly aspects of like Cyclopean masonry, ashlar masonry at some of these cities where they're building on a grand scale like you would find on the Greek mainland.
Hmm.
Um, I would say that's probably the closest there, but the Cypriot archaeologists would probably disagree with me and just say, no, it's Cypriot architecture. And every site is different. I would say there's no blueprint. I mean, if you go to the Greek mainland and you look at the Mycenaean palaces, it really looks like there's a blueprint that they're following. The gates, the entry gates all look the same. Fortifications look very similar. And it's not the case on Cyprus.
hmm.
And certainly we know that after the collapse, when Cyprus is resilient, but it changes. We know that there are a bunch of city-states that arise and especially flourish in what is usually called archaic Cyprus. So, 7th century, 6th century, 5th century, which is different from Bronze Age Cyprus. But I think there's a reason it's called the melting pot. It's in between. It's one of these islands where you see a mixture of styles and you can point to things. Oh, yeah, that's really kind of Canaanite. That's kind of Egyptian. Yeah, that looks kind of Mycenaean. But overall, it's Cypriot. It's its own unique stamp. But part of the problem we've got is what you alluded to. The writing is Cypro-Minoan, and that has not yet been deciphered. And there are not really long texts. There's a line here, a line there, a sign here, a sign there. So we don't get history written by them.
Mm.
We see them mentioned in other people's histories, especially the Neo-Assyrians. All right, and we got the tale of Wenamun from the 10th century that talks about an Egyptian priest being shipwrecked in Cyprus. But reconstructing the history of Cyprus in the Bronze Age and early Iron Age is all from archaeology.
Mm.
And as a result, it's all, inferences and our best guess.
I guess the reason I'm so fascinated with what was happening in the Mediterranean is because you do have these trade networks that are potentially extending into Europe even, and these guys are situated right in the middle. And I'm trying to understand how similar it is to the world today. So if you think about the trade networks today, there's a lot of, what did you call it, down the line trading that happens for sure. But there's also a kind of merchant class overlaid on that in the modern world, right? So you have these entities, like I mentioned Amazon earlier, that's one of these entities. But you can imagine various permutations of this, even culminating in the stock market at some point or something, right? Is there any evidence to indicate that there was this kind of a superstructure overlaid on the Mediterranean world at that point in time? Because I'm still trying to understand how such a far-reaching place was so efficiently and effectively connected to these really well-evidenced inland empires that we know so much about. But it also stands to reason that anything that exists in the sea on ships is probably not going to leave much behind for us to understand materially what was the basis of that superstructure, should it have existed. Because, and we can get into this later, obviously the Phoenicians kind of take up the mantle of this in later years, but they seem like they're inheriting something else from earlier, some system of operation in the Mediterranean. And I'm not trying to like pin it on the Minoans or anybody in particular. I'm just trying to get a sense of how orchestrated you think that trade network was in this sort of top management level. Is there room for such a superstructure in the Bronze Age?
When you find out, let me know.
Okay, well,
Just getting
so
started.
when we were, that is true. We are just getting started. This is our second conversation on the topic. So there was something that we were thinking about last night when we were taking this walk, which is that if you have, so let me see if I can connect a couple of different dots. Bear with me. This is going to be a little rocky. So there are shipwrecks that are found throughout the Mediterranean, and some of which are also found off the north coast of France, I believe, where the ships all seem to be of a similar style. Is that an accurate understanding?
I think we're getting into Phoenician territory.
Are we? Is
Yeah.
this
The
too late?
collapse, yeah.
I see.
Yeah, I
Okay,
think
so
that's
They
this
are
is
maybe too
styled
late.
similarly,
Yeah. The shipwrecks we've got from the late Bronze Age are all in the Mediterranean. There's two off the coast of Turkey, Cape Gelidonia and Uluburun. There's another one off the coast of Greece, Pointy Rios. There's another couple off the coast of Israel by Haifa. But there's also a limited number of ways to make a boat back then. Um, our finding of the shipwrecks has pushed our knowledge back like more than 1,000 years. But to link that, I know you're not done with all of your dots, but I don't think that there is actually room for an overarching structure. Because like the ships you're talking about would imply that it was basically every person for themselves. The Minoans had their own navy and ships going out. The Egyptians have their own. The Canaanites have their own. Cypriots have their own. Even the Hittites have their own. So it's a competition, if you will. It's a mercantile class. It's like today, right? You've got all the competitors. But the
But
big
even
question,
today, if I could just interject really quickly, even today, like our Amazon delivers out here in the country, they drive their own cars, right? So, but they're still subservient to this greater distribution network in some sense that would
right?
be difficult to, if you just stop time right now and tried to evidence it might be a little bit difficult to reconstruct it, how the packages are exactly getting to the houses as well.
And we actually have the same problem back then. Yes, because what I was going to say actually fits even better into a response here. There's been the debate for decades as to whether the merchants that were involved in the trade of the late Bronze Age were private merchants or employed by the palaces. Like, were they the representatives of the kings and the pharaohs, or were they independent? Or were they some combination? And there has been no agreement on this, as you might imagine. So there's been compelling arguments put forth on all sides. What I would say is my answer to all these things. Which one was it? The answer is yes. It's all of the above. It really is, because we know, for example, that there is a private merchant named Senaranu who works out of Ugarit in North Syria. And we know he's private because we have a text that grants him exemption from paying a duty on the grain, the olive oil, and the beer that he is importing from Crete. Right? It's one of the earliest tax exemptions ever found. He's definitely a private merchant. But at the same site of Ugarit, in another couple of archives, there's actually 3 archives. Probably the best known is a guy named Ortenu. And Ortenu is both a private merchant and working for the palace. So he's both. Now, I don't know if that meant on a shipment part was his and part was from the palace, or if it was like, okay, I'm working on 2 shipments for the palace, but here's a shipment for me. Don't quite know how that works, but certainly in the archive, he is known as an agent, a merchant of the palace, but he's also private. And so that's why I would answer yes. I think you've got private merchants. I think you've got state-sponsored merchants. And I think you've got some that played both sides of the field. Now, one of the suggestions that's been made for the collapse is that the private merchants may have overthrown, if you will, Amazon and gone into individual business for themselves, and that we're looking at the rise of private merchants, and that undermined the society, that the economy, the trade network that had been in place. So if that's the case, then maybe your super overarching structure could be said to have been in place and then has collapsed when these individual merchants went rogue, if you will, except that I don't know that we have evidence that they did go rogue or that there was anything in place. Again, it's all hypotheses based on the little that we know. And you mentioned a moment ago that in terms especially of the shipwrecks, but it's also true on land, we've only got maybe 10% of what was once there. Everything else has disintegrated, perished, been converted into other objects. Copper and tin is now a bronze vessel or a bronze sword. The wine has been drunk. The olive oil has been eaten. Most of it's gone. So we are, and don't get me wrong, this is what I love about archaeology. We are working with a jigsaw puzzle, which is comprised of more than one jigsaw puzzle, but we have no idea how many of them. We don't know how many pieces there were originally. Is this a 50-piece jigsaw puzzle? Is it a 5,000-piece jigsaw puzzle? And we don't have the cover with the picture. So we don't know what it's supposed to look like to help us put it together. So
I think that's what makes it so exciting as a science for ordinary people too, is that you can't help but use your imagination when you start looking at the few little, you have to fill in gaps. It's not like something you can just run an experiment on in a test tube and answer your question, right? I think about the deep archaeological history of North America, where they were like, there was no people here, prior to this date. And then one day they just found some footprints in white sands, right? And they had to push the whole calendar back by like thousands and thousands of years.
I think there's 10,000 years that they had to add.
It's unbelievable just how in 10,000 years you would leave a couple of footprints. It's like, what else are we possibly missing? And then you kind of apply this to the nearer history as well by degrees, and you just can't help but you need these hypotheses, you need these pieces to fill in the gaps in the record one way or the other. And of course, everybody's going to have a different take on that because everybody's imagination works a little bit differently.
Right. But that is where one of the main problems in archaeology lies, because you have these big gaps and because seriously anybody can jump in and present a hypothesis. This is where you get the crazies. This is where you get, ooh, there was a civilization here that's, disappeared and it was here before the Ice Age, but not. I mean, show me the evidence for that. There's no evidence for it whatsoever, no matter what the pseudo-archaeologists claim. But that is where people like Eric von Daniken march on in with their ideas about aliens and runways for spaceships to land, at Nazca, things like that. So while, yes, it's fun and it's challenging and it makes it interesting, it also means that anybody can have an idea. And if you disagree with them, they say, oh, you're the establishment. You're just trying to suppress knowledge, or you found stuff and you're hiding it. And we're like, are you kidding? If we had found something like that, we'd be the first to be trumpeting it everywhere. But, claiming something and then saying that I can't disprove you is not, it's not science.
Well, hypotheses are not all created equal. I mean, that's the thing that gets left out. It's like hypotheses are definitely unprovable statements that can fill in your theory, but they're not created equal, and you can evaluate them on their own face.
Mm-hmm.
Like, are they internally consistent, and are they externally consistent? Like, do they actually match up with the rest of the story that is evidenced being told from all these other angles? And do they even contradict themselves? Do you have to introduce magic to make this thing happen, essentially? Right. And so I think that we can welcome hypotheses into pursuit of knowledge, but they have to be judged according to some very objective standards. And I don't think there's really a problem with that. And the people that you've pointed to are often having to go outside and contradict other pieces that they'd rather not look at. They're trying to contradict. We actually reviewed a book about this recently concerning the Bronze Age too, where this gentleman was making this hypothesis, and he was just ignoring all sorts of things that would have gotten in the way of him making his theory, and that's the problem, right? So,
right,
I think there's a way to deal with such things.
And what's wild though is that there are these moments where somebody does see something that everybody else has missed, because this is kind of how Troy gets discovered, right? Some guy is reading the Iliad and he figures that it cannot possibly be a mythological story. And as far as I can tell from reading the way that people reacted to it at the time, everybody thought he was just crazy, that was a real place.
Yes and no.
Okay.
You're right. That is the general story that is put out. And it's a wonderful story of this amateur who made a fortune and then retired to pursue his life's dream. And got the better of the establishment, if you will, which, it's a great story. It's also not completely true. If you dive down into the murky depths, it turns out that there were a lot of scholars that were looking for Troy. And by a lot, I mean like a half dozen. But there were definitely people that were wandering around looking for Troy that were convinced, let's put it this way, they were convinced that if the Trojan War had happened, it would have left something behind, and that could be found archaeologically. So Schliemann, in a way, was a Johnny-come-lately by a couple of decades. And if you read the publications at that time, there were quite a few people and sites that had been pointed to. And in fact, one of the sites that Schliemann thought might have been Troy, a place called Bernabashi, had been suggested by a number of other archaeologists as a potential. So Schliemann, in most cases, was not going to brand new sites. He was going to ones that previous scholars had suggested and looking at them for himself. So in the case of Hissarlik, it was already owned by another guy. The Calvert amateur archaeologist and all that. And when he heard that Schliemann was looking, he went to him. He says, you don't have to look anymore. I own it. Let's join forces, right? You're looking for Troy and you have a lot of money. I already own Troy and I don't have any money. So let's join and we'll dig it up. So, so once you realize that, then you realize that Schliemann was in among a group of believers, if you will. He just was the one that started actually digging and then found evidence that supported his hypothesis and did not go against all of the others. So, yeah, there are a number of cases where you've got really talented outside amateurs that come in and are able to do things. I'll just give you one other. Michael Ventris, who deciphered Linear B, which turned out to be an early version of Greek. Right? Linear B is used by the Mycenaean palaces, Mycenae, Tyrans, Pylos, to keep accounting records. They're on clay tablets, and we couldn't read them. But Carl Blegen had found a lot of them in the Palace of Pylos in 1939. And then Michael Ventris, this architect, who was also a cryptographer, was able to decipher them and made very famous announcement on the BBC in 1952. But when you dive down into it, turns out that there were a couple other people that had been working on it, right? Including Emmett Bennett at University of Wisconsin, including a lady who taught in New York at one of the universities, whose name, unfortunately, I'm blanking on at the moment. Alice Kroeber, there we go. Alice Kroeber was central, and others played a role as well. But Ventris was the one who made the final breakthrough and sent it around to the others who said, yeah, you're right. But there's no way Ventris could have done what he did if Kroeber hadn't already been working on it, Bennett hadn't been working on it, and and they helped him out to a certain extent. So I think that's very frequently the case, right? But always in most of the books today, it says this architect from outside the profession was able to crack Linear B. And then you're like, yeah, but there were a couple of experts that helped him along the way. So, and I think Schliemann and Troy is another example, which is why I'm going to be very skeptical of any, I hesitate to call them outsider because they'll jump on that, but somebody who is not rigorously trained in the methodology and the hypotheses and the testing of the scientific method to come up with a hypothesis that they like, that where they've cherry-picked the data, they are not likely to be correct. I would
think
say.
that that's the piece, right? So the book that Shiloh's talking about was this book by Gavin Menzies, and it was about he wrote this book about the lost empire of Atlantis, and he places Atlantis as being on Thera prior to the eruption, and he makes this extensive case for how the Minoans were able to go all the way to North America and get the copper from the old copper culture and bring it back, and this is why they were so wealthy. And when you read it, the surface level story, it moves a little fast for the claims that are being made. And then you start spot checking stuff and you realize that what he's done is he's taken pieces that they're all there. Like there's all of these different jigsaw puzzle pieces. Like there is an old copper culture in North America, and there is a strange genetic link between the Middle East and the Great Lakes region through haplogroup X. And the Minoans did seem to have seafaring ships. And then you start to spot check and you realize that he's kind of like pulling and pushing on all of these facts in order to stretch them into place. And that's the cherry picking thing that you're talking about, where I've really come to believe that outsider theories are absolutely fine, but the storyteller has to be reliable. And the reliability aspect of it is what falls apart because people are so in love with some pet theory that they start out with that they're willing to do this stretching thing to fit pieces to the story.
Yeah.
And this is a problem in all sorts of fields, and I don't think that it's limited to outsiders. I don't know if you follow, biomedical research at all, but there was the high-ranking professor at Stanford who had been pushing this amyloid hypothesis for the origin of Alzheimer's for like 20 years. He had gotten millions of dollars in grants, and it ended up being that almost all of it was falsified.
Hmm.
Like, he was just so in love with this hypothesis, and he believed in it so much. And then you have, do you remember Elizabeth Holmes, the Theranos lady, who is like, with
Mhm.
this one drop of blood, we can do all of these tests. Like, this is not unique to outsider archaeology or outsider theories. It just seems to be this deep human tendency to think that you have seen something that everybody else has missed, and to
Mhm.
become so impassioned and so in love with that you're going to be the one to prove it, that connecting it rigorously falls by the wayside. It's like, but we'll figure that out later. Like, once enough people are interested in this, we can pursue it and it'll be fine.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. And the thing is, with those situations, they make a great story.
Mm.
And they make a story that people want to believe. And in many cases, the story that they create is far more interesting than the mundane story that we've actually got, right?
Mm.
In one of my books, I forget which one, I think it was From Eden to Exile, I said something like, a good story concocted out of whole cloth or whatever is much more fun than the dull and dusty story that we usually tell. Yeah, with Gavin Mendes, for example, yes, there is a theory that, well, a hypothesis which I adhere to, that the eruption of Santorini may be at the basis of the story of Atlantis. It makes perfect sense to me. I don't see any other good candidate for it, but that's where it ends. That's
That was
just
the
like
best
that.
part of the book, actually. I will say
Okay.
that was the most compelling part of the book. Yeah.
Well, and it does fit because, we do have trade between the people at Akrotiri, which is on Santorini, and Egypt and elsewhere. And certainly, if Santorini blew up, and it impacted the Minoans, which we know it did, the ash blanketed their island. They do make it back. They bounce back. They're resilient. They're back within a couple of decades, a century at most. But if the Minoans and the people from Akrotiri had suddenly stopped coming from Egypt, and they had heard a bang and seen the smoke and the pumice. And there is an inscription from Egypt called the Tempest Stele, which may be a record of the eruption. Then I could really see how they could make up the story. But for instance, it's got nothing to do with the collapse of the late Bronze Age, which many people want it to be part of it.
Right.
But it's from back in 1600 BC, and the collapse is at 1200. So,
And it'd be kind of weird for
yes,
Plato not to remember that, Like, it seems like that eruption, there's no way that didn't impact everything. You have an eruption. Some of these eruptions mess up the climate. They mess
yeah,
up the sunlight, the rain patterns. I mean, there's no way that wasn't important that early on in history.
exactly.
And there's an
Yes,
island with a smoldering crater in the middle of the Mediterranean that your people are associated with. And so I feel like you're probably going to tell stories about, like, craters are just begging for a story. Like, we live near Crater Lake. I'm like, come on, you need to
And
have
then
a
the indigenous
story.
people here have a story, and that eruption was 6,000 BC or something.
Dude, I think they think it was like 7,000
It was a long
BC.
time ago, and the
I can
indigenous
look it
people
up.
still have mythology referring to it. So I'm like, there's no way that people weren't somehow encoding that in the
right,
downstream Greek
right,
traditions.
right. Well, and in the case of Santorini, or rather, let's flip it. In the case of Atlantis, the story is told to Solon, the lawgiver, when he went to Egypt in the 6th century, where he was bragging about Athens. And they said, you don't even know your own history. 9,000 years ago, this is what happened. Now, chop a zero off and say it was 900. And yeah, Santorini blew up about 900 years, give or take, before Solon. And then Solon told his son, who told his son, who told Plato, who wrote it down. Now, bear in mind, of course, there's a huge number of scholars who think that Plato is just making the whole thing up, which is quite possible because it's his ideal state and the ideal philosopher king and all of that. But anyway, that part of Gavin Mendes is, you're not going to argue about that. Yes, it's a hypothesis that Atlanta and Santorini are the same thing. But copper from Michigan has never been found in the Mediterranean. It's all from Cyprus. It's all from right around there. There's no copper from Michigan.
Has anybody tested it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. The copper from Michigan is staying up in Michigan or wherever, but it's not coming to mainland Greece. It's not coming to Egypt. That's where I
Well, the
put the
thing
book
that's really
down.
horrifying about his proposal, I mean, he does make the case that it's this incredibly pure copper found in one of the shipwrecks.
The Ullabrun.
The Ullabrun.
It's
Okay.
not. The Ullabrun is from Cyprus. But anyway,
no,
yes, go
I'm
on.
not trying to support his claim. I'm actually just trying to say that what he does is he says that because this is really pure copper and the copper in Michigan is really pure, it must be the same. But he doesn't even mention the fact that you can get really pure copper from Cyprus. That's the shameful part is I'm like, he buried a really cool idea. He should have written the book just about Santorini and tried to make some sort of mythopoetic loosely grounded in the material record as much as he needed to. But instead, he just shuns really important pieces of evidence in favor of this much more. It just really buries the impact of that the work could have had, and that's kind of my plea to people, both in the mainstream and as outsiders. It's like, look, don't do that. Don't just ignore things that are inconvenient to your fantastical story. Focus on what you actually can tell, because there probably is something you're seeing if this is exciting you and it's really arousing your passionate exploration. Like there's something there, but don't just ignore things. They're not going to go away just because you don't talk about them in your book. Like they're there. You can't erase pieces of the puzzle.
Nor can you cherry pick the pieces that you use. The problem is, and I've said this in previous books, the problem is the general public does not know who or what to believe. You pick up Mendes's book and you haven't had classes in this in college or high school or reading in your adult life. It sounds like a great story and it sounds plausible. You're like, okay, fine. And then you end up sitting next to me at a dinner party and I'm like, oh my God, no. And you're like, well, why not? Try and prove it. My story is not nearly as fascinating. And my story is mostly saying no, 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 no. So,
it's really funny because we've recently started to have this frame for the way that people engage with ideas. And I think that it also applies to archaeology, which is that some people really want to do science and they really want to understand and they really want to map reality. And then some people really want to go to science church. And science church is this mythological story that's told with some of the starting pieces of science. They have those puzzle pieces in there, but what they do is they tell this mythological, cosmological story of massive significance. So you can sit there and go, wow.
mm-hmm.
And it's just, it's pervasive and it feels like there's just two types of people.
Absolutely. And, and Mendes, bless his heart, probably laughing all the way to the bank. Who knows? or he really believes what he has said. That's fine. But there are other people, especially those looking for Noah's Ark and the Ark of the Covenant and all of the biblical things, the parting of the Red Sea. And that's where we come back to something you had said earlier. And it may be that it's the case of Mendes as well. I don't know. We'd have to ask him. They come to the table with a hypothesis and they fit the data to it. so that they can prove it, which is backwards. Like what I did in 1177 is I looked at all the data, looked at where it was leading me, and then said, here's what I'm going to suggest based on everything that I've seen. But I did not come to it saying, in fact, I didn't come to 1177 saying it was multi-causal in terms of the collapse. I came to it saying, I'm not sure what it was. So-and-so has suggested drought, so-and-so has suggested famine, this person suggested disease, this person suggested invaders. I said, let's look at the pros and cons of each of them and figure it out. And in the end, I thought, wow, they're all pretty compelling. What if they all happened? But I didn't sit here and go, say to Rob Tempio, hey, I have an idea for a new book. I think there are lots of things that caused it, and now I'm going to go prove it. So I think the way you put it just now was pretty good. There's science, and then there's Science Church. Is that what you called it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pardon the interruption, but I have to ask you for a favor. If you are enjoying this podcast, then consider coming over to patreon.com/DemystifySci and signing up to support us with a small, recurring donation. This is what keeps us free of advertisements, of sponsorships, of shilling, green, goblin, gambling kings, or whatever is making the rounds at this current moment. And we hope that you will support us in our mission of providing the best ideas out there for absolutely free. In return, you get to join our weekly gathering that we host behind the scenes, where we chop it up about all of the ideas that we present on the podcast. And so come on over to patreon.com/DemystifySci and support the podcast today. I'll see you there. Have you done a lot of field archaeology?
Yep. I've got about 30 seasons of excavation or survey. Yeah, almost every summer. Sure. So I consider myself a field archaeologist first and foremost, before I consider myself an ancient historian. So that's all I ever wanted to do from the age of 7 was to dig, will travel. Yeah.
What sites do you have under your belt? Where have you focused on in your career?
I've been, in terms of countries, I've been mainly Greece, Crete, Cyprus, Jordan, Egypt, North America. Mostly the Mediterranean, but I've dug in Athens at the Agora. I dug at Megiddo, biblical Armageddon in Israel. And those are probably the two best known sites. So usually it's a much, much smaller site that nobody's ever heard of, where we're excavating to try and prove or disprove a hypothesis that somebody has or answer an anthropological question. So yeah, I think I've definitely got 32, 33 seasons at probably 16 different sites. So it used to be I picked a country I hadn't been to and found a dig, and then went early and came back late and traveled. So that's where
incredible.
Egypt came in. That's where Jordan came in. So, but after a while, I got tired of excavating at sites that nobody had ever heard of. And so that was when I joined Megiddo in 1994 and went every other year until 2014, worked my way up from volunteer to co-director. And then from a friend that I met on that dig, we split off and opened up our own dig, where we've been since 2005. So, but everybody's heard of Megiddo. Not that many people have heard of Cabri. So mostly because we don't know the ancient name. That's the modern kibbutz name. But
this might lead us into the after times a little bit as well. So the Megiddo, what year was this? Was this part of the ancestors the descendants of the Canaanite peoples?
So Megiddo is inhabited for almost 5,000 years.
Whoa.
But really for about 3,000 important ones, I would say. So from the early Bronze Age, from 3000 BC right through the Roman period, so 4th century AD. So you've got Canaanites there. You've got the collapse there. There's a level that is the collapse. You've got Tutmosis III fighting the first historical battle. He writes down the details. You've got Israelites there. You've got Neo-Assyrians, Neo-Babylonians, Persians. Romans had a legion there. So there's 20 different cities, different levels, one on top of another at
Wow.
Megiddo. And
A
so
real
you can,
crossroads type place.
yeah, you can follow the history.
So was Canaan continuous? First of all, is Canaan really even like a nation, or is it just a region? Is it like an
It's a region.
ethnogeographic
No,
pocket?
it's a geographic region,
Yeah.
basically.
Victory. We came to this conclusion yesterday as we were walking down the street because there's this it seems to root so many different cultures. And at
Mhm.
some point I was like, it seems almost impossible to think of Canaan as being
An administration or something.
yeah, like some kind of central empire because of
Mhm.
how many people rooted in it and came from that place. It seems geographic. And so I'm
But
so glad to hear you
yeah,
say
I was
that.
going to ask though, was it continuous across the collapse?
Well, it depends where you look and at whom you look. So if you're back in the Middle Bronze Age, the early part of the second millennium, like the time that Abraham and the patriarchs are supposedly wandering around, we would call most of the people there Canaanites. But what would they call themselves? They would each have their own ethnicity, more than likely. But you've got Amorites and other people around. When you get to the late Bronze Age, the time that I was studying, the time of the Amarna letters in Egypt, 14th century, 13th century, you've got lots of little city-states. And the Egyptians all referred to it as Pa-Kana'a, Canaan. But the individual people would probably not have said, I'm a Canaanite. They would have said, I'm from Megiddo. I'm from Hatzor. I'm from Jerusalem. And indeed, it's exactly what we see in the Iron Age with the Phoenicians. They wouldn't have said, I'm a Phoenician. That's the later Greek name. They would have said, I'm from Beirut. I'm from Tyre. I'm from Byblos. So Canaanites is our name for them. And then, of course, when you get after the collapse, even the Canaanites per se goes away, and you're left with individual ethnicities, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Aramaeans, the Israelites, right? So, but again, you walked into a city like Jerusalem or Megiddo in the 8th century BC, and you went up to each person and said, what are you? You would have gotten a different answer from each person, I would say. So this is where we have to be careful. It's us putting labels, monikers back on them. I mean, even the famous sea peoples didn't call themselves sea peoples. Even the Egyptians didn't call them sea peoples. That's what the early French Egyptologists called them. So we have to be very careful of how we explain things in terms of our world versus their world. So yes, the Canaanites are continuous, but only, I would argue, for the second millennium BC. And after the collapse, we basically lose what we would call Canaanite culture, and it's assimilated into the other cultures. So, but there again, you've got the question that I have been wrestling with now for years. Does that mean they're resilient and they're able to transform, or does that mean that they are fragile and vulnerable and they disappear? Right? Which way is it? So, in ranking the societies as to how well they did in the aftermath of the collapse, I had a real problem with the Canaanites of the southern Levant. Were they in my category 5, which is the worst, or were they in my category 1 or 2, which is the best? It just depends on
Well,
how you
the
define
Phoenicians
it.
seem like they're kind of one of the clear winners from your
Phoenicians,
diagnostics, but aren't
yes.
they a Canaanite adjacent people in some sense? It's like the coastal region of Canaan in some sense.
They're not even Canaanite adjacent. They are Canaanite, but
Mm.
they're from central Canaan. They're from what we would today call Lebanon. And yes, they, for whatever reason, seem to survive the late Bronze Age collapse virtually unscathed. No destructions that we can find. But then again, there hasn't been all that much excavation in Lebanon in recent decades for obvious reasons,
Sure.
right? Starting with the Civil War in the 70s. So it may be that that type of information is waiting to be discovered and will change our minds. But for now, yeah, it looks like the Canaanites in the north, up in Syria, were impacted differently from the ones in the center, which would be Lebanon, and they were impacted differently from the ones in the south, which would be today basically Israel. So the Phoenicians are the central Canaanites. But again, they wouldn't have said they were Canaanites. More than likely, they would have said, I'm from Byblos, I'm from Tyre. All right, so this is where you get this well-known book by Josephine Quinn called In Search of the Phoenicians and trying to find them. But they're, the later Greek historians, Herodotus and Thucydides, in a way, do us a favor by lumping them and just calling them the Phoenicians, just like the French Egyptologists talked about the Sea Peoples. So we can then discuss them as a group, even though they would have said, I'm not in the group with him. I'm totally different. But we are able to look at them as a phase, if you will.
Oh, God, there's so much to pick on there. I mean, in some sense, the Phoenicians don't get the play in modern discussions of this time period that they probably deserve. That's been my read on it over the last decade or so that I've been interested in this. And part of me wonders if that doesn't have to do with our history going through the bottleneck of Rome with the Carthaginian debacle. But part of me just feels like the Phoenicians are these people who rise out of the ashes that of this collapse in some sense. Were they continuous? Were they participating in these pre-collapse trade networks as well? Were they a new name to an older people? What's with the history that we can read from Sidon and Byblos and what am I missing? There's one more. Tyre. Yeah.
Tyre, right.
Were they how were they knitted into the Minoan and Mycenaean worlds?
So I would say that the way you phrased it is a good way to put it. It's a new name for an older people. They are there. For sure. We see them in the Amarna letters in the 14th century BC, right, where we've got 60 letters, 60 clay tablets from Ribhada, the king of Byblos. And we've got other letters from the king of Tyre and the king of Beirut and all that. So they are definitely participating in the international trade and diplomacy and all that, though they were vassals to the Egyptian kings, Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, and that's where we see all these.
What year is this, by the way? Approximately what time? Where are we talking about?
About 1350 BC, middle of the 14th century. So we do know that they are players then, but minor players. They're not, the G8. They're not even the G12. They're in, the G50. They're in there, but interacting. But they do
so
survive.
I have a question, because in the beginning of 1177, you have a map, and you map the different empires. And I noticed that you basically have Egypt's empire extending all the way up through Byblos to Kadesh. And so is this, when you say that they were vassals of Egypt, is this why you derive this map? Because you figure that there's sort of some distant lordship that is paying fealty to the main kingdom of Egypt during this time?
Yes, that's it in a nutshell. Yes, but it's more complicated. It's always more complicated, right? Always. Yeah. That particular region of Canaan, what today we would call Syria, Lebanon, Israel, that region is fought over by the Hittites coming down from Anatolia and the Egyptians coming up from Egypt. And it culminates at the Battle of Kadesh which is why the border is there. And that battle, which is fought in about 1274 BC, is a draw. It's a stalemate. But both sides claim a victory. And when they signed a peace treaty, which is considered to be one of the world's first peace treaties, and in fact, there's a copy of it in the UN building in New York, that ended the animosity, supposedly, between Egyptians and Hittites, but it left the borders in Canaan right where they had been. If you read the Amarna letters, though, which are from 75 to 100 years earlier, you can see that Egyptian influence extended all the way up to Ugarit, but that the Hittites are causing problems. And a number, as I said in my newest book, not that I want to promote all the books, but Love, War, and Diplomacy, the story of the Amarna letters, I suggest that the vassal letters show us that a lot of the infighting between the vassal kings is actually a proxy war between the Hittites and the Egyptians. And that proxy war explodes into open warfare at the Battle of Kadesh and elsewhere. So this is also, I mentioned Troy as a contested periphery. Canaan in this time period is also a contested periphery, this time between the Egyptian and the Hittite empires. So, and I'm not actually even sure if I put that in the book, but I really should have. Yeah.
That explains a lot. That makes a ton of sense, actually.
Yeah.
What about the
hold on one
okay,
second.
no,
One
go
second.
ahead, please.
There's one other piece. So you say that you're excavating at Cabri,
Yes.
and Cabri is actually really interesting because that's where one of those Minoan bull leaping frescoes was discovered.
Similar. Yes.
And
Yes.
were you the one who discovered that fresco?
No, I
I
was
see.
not. That was that was the previous team of Wolf Dietrich Niemeyer from Germany and Aaron Kempinski from Tel Aviv. 1986 through about 1990, they were excavating a painted floor, plaster floor painted in what they said was a Minoan technique. And I would agree. It's Aegean. I mean, there are red lines making squares where you would take a string and dip it in red paint, then pull it tight really fast, and it creates a perfectly straight line. And in some of the squares are things like irises and crocuses, which are, flowers you would find on Crete. So there are 4 sites that have these Minoanizing scenes. Cabri is one of them. The best known is Daba in Egypt, and that's the one with specifically bull leaping scenes, such as you would see at Knossos on Crete. But there's also Alalak, which is up where Syria meets Turkey. And then, let's see, Daba, Cabri, Alalak, Katna. Katna is the other one in modern-day Syria. And these 4 second millennium palaces have these paintings. And so the previous team at Cabri found that one. And so they found it right as I was writing my dissertation. So it became part of my dissertation. But then in 1993, Kempinski died. And Niemeyer went on to other things, other excavations, including being director of the German Archaeological Institute in Athens. And my colleague, Asafios Orlando, who had dug there as a student in the 90s and had always wanted to come back, he said to me in 2003, I think the palace is bigger than they thought it was. And I've got remote sensing data that indicates it. You want to go with me and test it and see if the palace is bigger and what else might be there. And there was nobody that had the permit to excavate. So we applied for it and got it and started digging then 2005. So we are the second team there. We did find fragments from other wall paintings, other floor paintings. And indeed, the last week of our season in 2019, It's always the last week that you find something good. It's an archaeological maxim. We found another painted floor, also in an Aegean style. But we found it, we weren't looking for it. We were testing to see if ancient DNA adheres to plaster while you're laying down a plaster floor. And so a couple of grad students were drilling through the plaster floor that we knew was there, and they came to me and said, "We found another floor below." I said, "Yeah, we know there are 4 floors." And they're like, "Yeah, but this one's painted." And I said, "Yeah, we know one of them's painted red." They said, "No, no, 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 no. This is painted like the famous one." And I'm like, "Wait, what?" And I went over, and they had gone through all the floors. And in the last floor, sure enough, it was not big, 10 centimeters by 15 centimeters, but I could see orange, red, black paint, and it's in the room next to the floor that had been found back in 1986 or so, and it's waiting. We had
Wow.
to cover it up, and then COVID hit, and then the wars hit, and we haven't been back to dig at Cabri since that week in 2019. So it's sitting there. I don't know what it's going to look like, but it will be Aegean style.
What do you
And
make
of
of that?
course,
Like, what the heck are the Minoans doing over there? What's going on? Or
that's
why
the
the influence? I mean, there's
that's
also
the
this Philistine genetic connection to Crete as well, right?
that we
What's this
get a
all
little
about?
bit later. Yeah. So remember, I got into this field because I'm interested in international connections and relations. And these paintings, both wall and floor, are, I mean, what are they? Are they roving artists? Are they artists loaned by one king to another? We do know from the ancient texts that they sent around musicians and doctors and artists and all that. So, but also, are these artists fleeing from the eruption of Santorini? Because our paintings are about the same date and they look very similar. But we have done radiocarbon dating recently, and they have said that Cabri is older than we thought by about 100 years. And if that's true, if it's not a mistake with the radiocarbon dating, then our paintings, which look like they're made by Minoans, are earlier than the ones that Knossos and Akrotiri. In which case, it might be Sir Leonard Woolley, when he was excavating at Alalak in the 20s, he suggested that the influence on painting came from Canaan to the Aegean and not the other way around. And he might have been right, but we have to see, and it depends on the radiocarbon dating. So again, this is why archaeology is so interesting, that one discovery and a couple of radiocarbon datings can totally flip what we thought we knew. So, and for somebody interested in international relations, this is fascinating. And then we get to what you alluded to, the new the new old DNA, the new ancient DNA from Ashkelon, suggesting the Philistines may have had an Aegean or Western Mediterranean connection. So I tell you, everything was more complicated back then, and everybody was more interactive. That, forget 6 degrees of separation, it's 3 degrees or less. So yeah, and the beauty of this, done scientifically, is that our knowledge changes every couple of decades, and what we thought we knew turned out didn't know it at all. So, but that's science. That's the beauty of it.
Yeah, it also, I mean, I don't have a clear picture of this, but it does open up some sort of cultural continuum when we start thinking about these Phoenicians too, because I want to really try to understand why you think, and obviously you write about this in the book, but I want to air out some of the reasons why you think the Phoenicians were so successful among all of the different peoples that came out of this collapse. But if they're from this Canaanite culture, if there's some overlap with the Mediterranean maritime cultures and the Canaanite cultures, then maybe it's easier to understand how this was a sort of shared cultural, this ability to facilitate these trade networks and to run the seas and all of that was an older tradition that the Phoenicians inherited in some sense.
And there is an interesting link here because if you look at the frescoes from, I think it was Akrotiri, there's a fresco in Akrotiri that has Minoan ships on it.
Well, it's got ships, yes.
It's got
Yes.
ships.
Ships,
Okay,
yeah.
and so you're not sure that they're Minoan ships.
They might be Cycladic. I mean, Akrotiri, Santorini is one of the Cycladic islands. So let's just say they're Aegean-style ships. Yes.
And when I look at images of Phoenician ships, they seem very similar to the ships that are in that fresco at Akrotiri. But then if I go and I look at the excavated Egyptian ships, they seem much smaller. They have far fewer oars. They don't seem to be quite as hefty as these ships. And so if we have this connection between Minoans that are painting frescoes in Canaan, and then we have
Akrotirians or whoever.
or Akrotirian
Aegeans, yeah.
Aegeans painting frescoes in Canaan. And then we have, after the Bronze Age collapse, that there is a seafaring merchant class that emerges in Canaan that has ships that look very similar to these Aegean ships. Is there a plausible cultural descendancy? Or do you think that they, like you said earlier, that there's just a limited number of ways that you can build ships and they just end up with the same looking boats?
So it's an excellent question. I would say there's a limited number of ways you can build ships at that time. But I would also point to the fact that it looks like everybody had ships. Everybody had a navy. Everybody had merchant class ships going. And if you look at the drawing that Ramses III leaves us of the naval battle that they fight in 1177, that's so detailed that you can see the differences between the ships and the rowers and the warriors and all of that. So what I would say there, without dodging your question entirely, is there is a wonderful book by an archaeologist named Shelley Waxman, who's at Texas A&M, called Ships and Seamanship in the Bronze Age Aegean, something like that, or Ships and Seamanship in the Bronze Age. And that goes through all the different ships and would answer your question there. But I would be loath to suggest some kind of continuity or that, hey, we got the Minoans living over in Canaan because the boats look similar, or the Phoenicians. They are all vaguely different, and we would want a maritime expert here to explain to us the difference, especially Jeffrey Emanuel, who's up at Harvard, has looked at the rigging and the square sails and various other things. So I would pull back a bit to the larger picture and just say that when the collapse happened, everyone else gets hurt enough that their mercantile capabilities and their navies and all that are either gone completely or decimated such that they can't participate as they had. So we know that Ugarit is destroyed. We know that Ugarit's destroyed and that it's not inhabited for another 400 years. Crete and its navy seem to be decimated and go away. Certainly the Hittite navy is decimated. I think, and I do say this in the book, the Phoenicians and the Cypriots stepped into the breach and they took advantage. And that is why when I ranked the 8 societies as to how well they did in the aftermath of the collapse, with 1 being the best and 5 being the worst, I put both the Phoenicians and the Cypriots up in category 1, which meant that they flourished while everyone else was disintegrating. And Nassim Nicholas Taleb has a term for this. He calls it anti-fragile. He actually called a book by that title. And this is basically when you flourish in the age of chaos. You take advantage of the conditions. And I think that both the Phoenicians and the Cypriots, who both retained their mercantile capabilities and sailing the wine dark sea, that they stepped in and just took over. And as some of my colleagues have said, the Mediterranean became a Phoenician lake. And that's where your Phoenicians start spreading, and you get them coming to Cyprus. And I think kind of partnering with the Cypriots, because wherever we find Phoenician stuff in the Aegean and Western Mediterranean, we also find Cypriot stuff. But that is when they found the city of Carthage in the 8th century, according to tradition, right? With Dido fleeing and heading over there. And eventually they grow strong enough that you've got the Punic Wars between the descendants of the Phoenicians and the Romans. So I do see a continuity. The Cypriots keep going, the Phoenicians keep going. But why, and that's at the heart of your question, why they were able to, I have no clue. No idea. They are more resilient for some reason. They are not as vulnerable for some reason. They are more resilient for some reason, but I don't know why. I think it could go back. Our discussions about the private merchants, it may have been because they were decentralized. I mean, the Hittites, when their head gets chopped off, they all go down. The Mycenaeans, when the palaces get burned, they go down. If you burn the city at Byblos, it doesn't affect the city at Tyre or the city at Beirut. So they're independent city-states. Their very decentralized existence may have been the key not only to their survival, but to the fact that they were then able to flourish. So that may be the answer. One of my colleagues has recently suggested that the whole idea of big empires and kingdoms and all that, like the Mycenaeans, was an experiment that failed. And it was the decentralized city-states that had been around in the Middle Bronze Age and now come back again in the Iron Age, that's actually the way to go. And the Phoenicians and the Cypriots are both that way. Remember the archaic city-states on Cyprus? That's exactly what they devolved to. So
Kind of feels like that's what's happening next in America, to be honest with you. There's these there's very, very powerful and politically distinct cities, and I guess they might end up having states. I mean, we live on the West Coast, so California is pretty obvious. LA and San Francisco couldn't be more different places, right? Technically part of the same state, technically part of the same country, but and the Texans are also kind of in their own like world over there, and I don't know, the East Coast, and you could kind of see how that would make sense in the aftermath of a huge imperial moment in history periodically.
Absolutely. And there are science fiction novels that are written around that. But yes, as somebody who grew up in both San Francisco and LA, and then later lived in Portland, in Oregon, you are absolutely right. And yeah, I mean, one of these days, who knows? You may get the United West Coast of Oregon, California, and Nevada, though I don't know, the days the Californians and Oregonians actually get along, that will be amazing, right? When we lived in Oregon, everybody was saying, "Don't Californicate Oregon," and it hasn't really changed. But yes, but if you look at the Northeast, the Southwest, the Southeast, the Middle, the flyover states, yeah, in a way, given today, it's kind of amazing that we're still the United States, and we might not be for long. Yeah.
Yeah, and an archaeologist looking back on this might see us as very distinct city-states in some sense, increasingly so perhaps as we
Hmm.
become more specialized and sophisticated. I also was thinking just how strange it would be to make sense of the wealth of California if you didn't have, mines and all this material riches. It's a very mercantile civilization in California. They export
Hmm.
to Hollywood, now they got the tech IP stuff. It would be very difficult to understand why these people were so bloody rich, looking
Yeah.
back at the material evidence.
Right. And especially if you get, I don't know, one of these big bursts up in the atmosphere and everything on the computers is erased in a flash, and then you don't know that we were a computer driven culture,
Right.
you would probably think we were almost illiterate. I mean, what's going to be left? And nobody's going to recognize the blobs of plastic that everybody's holding in their hands, which we know is melted cell phones, but in the future they might not know. So I actually wrote about something like that at the end of the Three Stones Make a Wall. The last chapter is on future archaeology and hypothesizing about what future archaeologists, like 2,000 years from now, will make of this. And I can guarantee that they're going to think Starbucks was a religion. And
Oh, for
they
sure.
they
Yeah.
may be right,
Yeah.
but I imagined this pantheon in which the green tressed lady of Starbucks is married to Ronald McDonald, and they've got outlets on every street. I mean, we are going to be so ripe for misinterpretation. Yeah.
Yeah, I love those kind of thought experiments because they really give you the humility to look at the material record you do have with you know a more realistic perspective.
Yes.
It's very easy to
Yes.
inherit the narratives from your mentors and everything about, we understand these people's religion and all of this, and it's worth remembering how difficult it would be for our own selves to be
Yeah.
recognized for who we are.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's a great book that I assign my students called Motel of the Mysteries, written by David Macaulay, where an archaeologist excavates a Motel 6 some 2,000 years
I
from now
love it.
and completely misinterprets everything. I mean, the guy on the bed is holding the sacred communicator, and the altar is up there. He's just holding a remote, and that's a
Yeah.
TV, but he completely misinterprets it. And it's fascinating how he does. So, anyway, a really fun little paperback. Yeah.
Do you think that we have a decent understanding of the Phoenicians?
It depends on who we are. I think if you got a couple of the scholars into the same room, you would have a knockdown, drag out fight over them. I won't name names, but there have been 3 or 4 books that have come out in recent years that present very different pictures of the Phoenicians. And not being a specialist in the Phoenicians myself, but looking at them almost as an outsider, it really seems to me like we've got the proverbial blind people and an elephant, and one has, one's got control of the tail, one's touching the trunk, one's touching the leg. And so they're all right to a certain extent, but they're only looking at bits and pieces. So, yeah.
And so, what's your, I guess, outsider synthesis of what you see from reading?
The outsider synthesis is kind of what I see what I say in the book, that they stepped into the chaos and took advantage and realized, I mean, they were, I would say, merchants overall, and they could see what was needed on both sides. So they seemed to be going to Spain, for instance, to look for silver, which was needed back in the Levant. And all of a sudden we start finding silver from Spain that the Phoenicians are bringing over. And so they're entrepreneurial. They're, they're I would say, opportunistic is what comes to mind. And that's where I think some things happen by accident. I suggested a couple of different times that along with the objects that I can see are being traded, that the ideas come as well and the innovations. And so I don't think the Phoenicians said, hey, we've standardized the alphabet. We're going to teach it to everybody. No, it was some Phoenician ship that tied up in a port in Greece, waiting for the wind to change for 3 weeks, and some drunken sailor swapping tales with a local Mycenaean, and then, and I'm just riffing here, says, how much do I owe you? And he's like, the guy starts scribbling marks, and he's like, the Phoenician's like, here, no, this is how we do it. And he wrote it down, and the guy in the port was like, wow, that's really good, and adopted it. And there's one scholar, I think he suggested writing could have been adopted and spread in Greece in as little as 3 weeks once the idea just took off. But I don't think
Well, it's phonetic, right? So you could write down someone else's word that you'd never heard before, like that didn't have necessarily any direct meaning to you.
Yeah,
And I think that's the real fire. There's the guy could have said, it's 3 denarii for this drink or whatever currency they have, and the guy says the name of the drink in Mycenaean, and then the Phoenician can actually write that word down.
Yeah.
That's the crazy thing, yeah.
Right. And anybody can write it. It's very democratic with a small d, if you will. Right. Back in the Amarna period, in the late Bronze Age, when we were talking about Akkadian being in the lingua franca, you had to spend years being trained in how to read and write Akkadian. Ditto for Hittite, ditto for Egyptian hieroglyphs. But this newly standardized alphabet, you could memorize it in an afternoon, and then you can write absolutely anything, and you can read it. So all of a sudden, everybody, if they wanted to, was able to read or write. It's very different. But again, I think it was an accident. I don't think they meant to spread it. But the purple dye that they were selling, now that they meant to spread and meant to sell. But the alphabet just kind of came along. And I think like turning to iron is kind of the same way. The Cypriots seem to have been at the forefront. I mean, they were the ones that were doing all the copper for the bronze, but they also seem to have been the ones that really jumped into making iron after the collapse, or actually partway during the collapse, but certainly afterward. And they started sending out weapons and tools that were made of both bronze and iron. Like there's one dagger in a cemetery in Greece at Parati where the blade is iron, but the rivets and the hilt are bronze. They're bimetallic. And it looks like, and again, we can't be sure because we don't have the writing, and the Cypriots don't tell us. But soon after those objects get to Greece on the one side and the Levant on the other, the people in those areas start making that stuff for themselves. So either the Phoenicians were really nice and said, hey, you like these? Well, here's how you make it. Or they were easily able to deconstruct and reconstruct it and, reverse engineer it for themselves. So, but I prefer to think that the Cypriots said, here, how's you make it? So, again, they're trying to export weapons and tools for profit, but then they were nice enough to say, here's how you make it, But, then that caused all sorts of problems because it takes more wood to burn to smelt iron. And all of a sudden, there you go, deforesting Cyprus and everywhere else. Maybe. I mean, the deforestation may have been caused by the climate change at the end of the late Bronze Age, or it could have been caused by smelting iron. I mean, there's all kinds of problems.
Or the climate change could be accelerated by the deforestation too. I mean, these are cyclic phenomena. These are feedback systems for sure. But I think you might have just struck on something important about the Phoenicians, which might have ensured their success in this period, which was their intellectual power. Like if they have, maybe for them it was just practical to develop this phonetic language. But, I have a feeling that they may have succeeded in their trade arrangements because people looked up to them for their intellectual prowess. Like if they were people that were relatable and you saw these guys coming to port and you're like, hey, like these guys are interesting, buy them a beer. Like, that there's something to that in the survival story of peoples, where it's not just, who has the biggest guns all the time. It's
Hmm.
also who has the coolest ideas. And if they were a respected intellectual people, there might be some thread of adaptability and survivability just baked into who they were, and their intellectual traditions, and how they obviously put some value on thinking their way into new solutions. And that's pretty cool,
Certainly.
because that's what we love here in the modern world, right? We give all the most money to the people with the big brains, and
Hmm.
people who can come up with solutions to problems. I mean, capitalism is essentially based on that tenet.
Hmm. Yeah, it's certainly a possibility. It's a hypothesis. I don't know how you would test it, but it's certainly one of the possibilities. I would say, yeah, interesting idea. We like things like that. We like cool new toys, and the standardized alphabet was definitely a cool new toy, and the Greeks played around with it. Right? There's like 32 different variations of the Greek alphabet before they settle on it, just in a couple, of decades or centuries, if you will. It's actually very debated now as to when the Phoenicians brought the alphabet to Greece. It was always accepted it was the 8th century, but now there's some scholars that are actually suggesting it might have come 300 years earlier, in the 11th century, which is right about the time when it's first standardized back home in the Levant. So, yeah, but it was definitely a cool toy in the aftermath of the collapse. So, yeah, possible.
Something that I was wondering about was the degree to which the Phoenicians were manufacturing their own cultural artifacts versus sort of transporting and dispersing the artifacts produced by all of the people that they interconnected. How much of their own like strong cultural goods were they producing versus things that they were just transporting?
Well, there we need to get somebody like Josephine Quinn in here,
Mm.
one of the Phoenician experts, to tell you. But I can start to answer that because we're able to identify Phoenician pottery, we're able to identify Phoenician storage jars, we're able to, or we thought we were able, at least, to identify things like Phoenician ivories. But of course, those are impacted by influences from the Aegean and Egypt and elsewhere. But definitely there is Phoenician and Phoenicianizing. So but I would say they're not different from anybody else. That is, each of these societies is making their own distinctive ceramics, whether in the Bronze Age or the Iron Age, distinctive enough that we can recognize them when we excavate them, and changeable enough over time that we're able to use them to date the levels that we're excavating in the remnants of the cities. So the Cypriots have their own style of pottery and everything else. Phoenicians, everybody does. So I would say, yeah, to a certain extent, they've got their own stuff. I'm not sure if I would go so far as to say it was a secret to their success. I would just say that it was what everybody was doing. There's no one IKEA across the Mediterranean back then. There's a whole set of mom and pop stores that are in each of the different nations that are selling their stuff. But each of the areas is unified enough that we, at least looking from our viewpoint, are able to point to it and say, oh, yeah, this is Phoenician, but the sherd that you found next to it, that's Cypriot, right? And the one that's next to it, oh, wow, yeah, that's Neo Hittite, right? So they're still importing stuff. And so, but the Phoenicians in particular, at least the thinking has been for quite a long time, they were very good at adapting other people and using the influences. So, especially in ivory work, but others did that as well. So, but it's no different. We see that in all the periods, I would say.
Interesting.
So I have this one other line that I was thinking might be good to wrap this to a point with, which is at the end of your second book, after 1177, you kind of have this vision for lessons learned, how to survive. I think there's a table 8, societal lessons learned from Bronze Age collapse and aftermath. And there's 7 points here, but a couple of them are really interesting, and we've sort of
Just a
smelled
couple.
them before. In particular, keeping the working class happy. I thought that was really interesting. What do we have evidence that people didn't keep the working class happy and that didn't work out for them during this period?
It's beginning to be suggested. Let's put it that way. Yes, that table I tossed in at the end, thinking that the readers would need a takeaway of some sort, something that they could, talk about at the dinner table. What have you been reading? Oh, I've been reading a book after 1177. Well, what have you learned? Well, there's this interesting table at the end of common sense things. I put it in, and sure enough, that's what many of the media reviews have, latched on to. But I also say that most of the 7 points are common sense. You don't even have to read the book to know that. And I would actually put keeping the working class happy into that category because I was thinking of things as, far apart as the French Revolution uh, and um, and other revolutions like that, whether you want to put the Russian Revolution in there as well. But in terms of the late Bronze Age collapse and its aftermath, what I was thinking of are suggestions that are beginning to be made for the Mycenaeans, that Martin Finet and Eric Weiberg and Joseph Moran, they work at Pylos and at Tiryns, respectively, and they have been suggesting that the lower class of the Mycenaeans might not have been all that happy, that they were being exploited by the upper class for the large-scale engineering projects like draining the Lake Copaeus Basin to make great farmland, like building the now famous Lion Gate at Mycenae, like building fortifications. And that when the Mycenaean palaces went down, not only might those lower class people, whether they're peasants or just farmers or whatever, they might have celebrated, but they also might have been part of what overthrew them, because there may have been internal rebellion at places like Mycenae, in which case you're looking at something like, French Revolution, Russian Revolution, things like that, where your lower classes rise up and overthrow the elite. So this is a fairly new set of speculations, if you will. I would say in the last, well, 10 years, which for an archaeologist is new. So,
That's really
but
funny that you say that, because Shiloh and I last summer went to Mycenae. We went to Tiryns, and we were sitting there, and for a long time we just kind of it's funny because you can sit outside the walls of Mycenae, and if you just scratch at the dirt, there's just all of these ancient shards of pottery that are just scattered all over the ground. It's a crazy historical place. But as we were sitting there, I think we came to this conclusion where it's like, how do you convince people to build a place like this? The kings aren't the ones that are building it. How do you motivate the people to collect these stones and to carve them and to assemble them? And then you have this huge pile of riches, and then everybody else is just digging in the dirt outside of it. It just seems like a fundamentally unstable condition for a
yes.
city-state or an empire to maintain, because the palace is not big enough to house everybody. So you know that there's people that are living outside of the nice, secure stone walls.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's always a lower city. Yeah. Well, this is the type of thing that Joseph Moran, the excavator at Tiryns, has been suggesting, that perhaps the Mycenaeans were more fragile and vulnerable than they appeared and have appeared to us. That and one could say the same about the Hittites. And so I do bring that up in the book, but It may be that it was like one of these hollow trees that looks good from the outside, but then you get not even a hurricane, but a pretty big storm, and boom, over goes your tree. So it may have been something like that, that it was kind of rotting from within, and that the exploitation of the lower class may have been part and parcel of that. And that's why people are now suggesting that when the collapse happened, first of all, your lower classes may have celebrated it. And then, secondly, when we talk about the collapse being terrible and bad, well, the response is, yeah, terrible and bad for whom? Might have been terrible and bad for the elite, but not for the lower classes, who again might have celebrated, their release from tyranny, if you will. But it also goes to the question of, like, that you just raised in building, say, the fortifications at Mycenae. Are the workers being paid for that? Or are they being pressed into labor? What is exactly going on? And we don't have the details for that, even from the Linear B tablets, which tell us how many chariot wheels are going in and copper is coming out. But just like it has turned out that the pyramids in Egypt were not built by slaves, but were built by people, perhaps farmers, after the harvest had come in, getting a second income, perhaps a permanent, set of workers, but they're not slaves. What's happening over in Greece? Who is building those? Same thing with the Hittites. Who is building the monumental fortifications at Hattusas? No, we're not told that. Now, I would like to think that they're paying the workers doing, the right thing, and they're not exploiting them, but maybe they are. These are some of the questions that it's really hard for archaeology to answer unless you find texts, and even then you don't really know what to believe. But so these are some of the newest questions that's being asked.
Well, it
And
also points back to the Phoenicians. Like maybe they actually were paying their oarsmen well. Like were they doing were they abiding by this principle in a way that some of the less successful descendants of this period were unable to adapt to? It really
right.
makes you wonder,
Well, yeah. Are the Phoenicians paying the men manning the boats, rowing? Were they paying them a decent living wage as opposed to the next person? So, or were there slaves? So, yeah. I mean, we don't know enough at this period. In later times, Roman and Punic and all that, we've got some more information, but there's a reason why the period after the collapse was, for the longest time, and by many people still, called the Dark Ages. It's dark to us because we don't have enough information to illuminate it. Oh, I argue in the second book that we do have enough information now to realize it's not as much of a dark age as we once thought it was, because we've got more information, and that we should just call it the Iron Age, which succeeds the Bronze Age. But we don't have answers to those kind of fundamental questions. And that's where I think we're going to turn our attention next, but I also don't know if we can answer them, right? Why did the Assyrians and Babylonians succeed, while the Mycenaeans and the Hittites did not in the aftermath of the collapse? Why did the Mycenaeans have to start from ground zero, and the Hittites basically disappeared, but the Assyrians and the Babylonians kept merrily going along, and the Cypriots and the Phoenicians are like, Yahoo, let's take over the Mediterranean. Though we can see what happened, and we can kind of answer to a certain extent why we think it happened, though that's always going to be open for debate. But what we don't know is why some did better and some did worse. And the problem with that is that that's where the lessons for us today lie. Because if we can answer why some were more resilient than others, we can try to figure out how to emulate that. Well, if we don't know why the Phoenicians and Cypriots survived and the Hittites and Mycenaeans did not, then ancient history is just ancient history with no lessons for us today. But I'm optimistic enough to think and to create table number 8 to say, here's the very least that we can learn and that we can use for today. Like, watch out for your water. Water's going to be important. We know it was important back then. It's important today, and so on.
I like that. That sharpens the question for some future conversations. And you gave us a lot of names of people we need to chase down too. So I'm looking forward to talking to some of these folks. So I thank you for that.
And maybe before you go, I know that you're writing a sequel to After 1177. And so can you tease people a little bit with what you're focusing on in that?
Yes, I can tell you in general terms, though I cannot tell you where it's headed. Because with 1177 and after 1177, as I said, I came into both without a preconceived notion. I gathered the data, and then I sat back and said, okay, what do I got? And what do I do with it? And I think it worked pretty well for both of those. So I'm doing the same for what I am calling the unintended trilogy, the third book in the unintended trilogy, and which will, of course, be called After 1177.
Excellent title.
Yeah, no, it won't be. That's too easy. No, and once again, Rob Tempio has suggested it's going to be called 776 BC, because you still have to get 2 sevens in there, right? But 776 BC is also traditionally the date of the first Olympics in Greece. So, but for my point of view, it's the first half or first quarter of the 8th century BC, and that is where I ended after 1177. So I'm picking right up where I left off. And I'm going to take it for about 400 years, down through Alexander the Great and his death towards the end of the 4th century BC. So I'll cover about 400 years, which is about what I covered in each of the previous books. But here, the subtitle is going to be The Clashing of Civilizations. And some of your listeners may remember back in the 90s, Huntington had an article called The Clash of Civilizations, which he then turned into a book, right? It was about the same time as Fukuyama, who I think was his student, came out with something called The End of History, right? And Huntington said there was going to be a clash between East and West, which there has been since the 90s. But I'm playing off of that and adding an ing to clash, the clashing of civilizations, because in these 400 years, which is when the network that collapsed during the Bronze Age collapse is back in place. By the early 8th century, they're back up and everybody is trading again. They're all internationalized. And so what I wanted to look at is what happened then once the network has been reformulated. And it turns out that we, among other things, move into a period of almost continuous warfare, where you've got Neo-Assyrians overthrowing northern kingdom of Israel. You've got Neo-Babylonians overthrowing Jerusalem and Judah, starting the Babylonian exile. You've got Persians coming in. You've got the Persian Wars when they try to take over Greece. You've got Athens fighting Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. You've got Alexander the Great going to the Near East and trying to conquer everybody. So it really is, to my mind, a clashing of civilizations for almost 400 straight years. And so I want to know, in part, why. One of the questions I'm asking is why that? And I don't have an answer yet going in. I'm just collecting the data. But I also want to see what happened in each of the societies, like I did in after 1177. But bear in mind also these centuries are what has been called the axial age, because this is the time we have the pre-Socratic philosophers in Greece, but it's also when we have Buddha and Confucius. And, I know that's to a certain extent outside of what I've been considering in the previous two books in terms of geographical areas, but it has been discussed. These centuries have been said something is special that's going on with all these new philosophies and religions, if you will. And so I want to look at that to a certain extent. So at the moment, I'm not sure where I'm going with it. I just have a geographical area and a chronological period that I'm investigating. And when I have written it and decided what I can come up with, I'll let you know.
Yeah, I would love to circle back and catch up with you after it's done and after we read it. That sounds great.
Absolutely.
That's definitely another piece of this cultural ancestral tale that has to be made clear eventually.
Right. And that's going to come even closer to us because in that you've got the 5th century in Greece with Pericles building the Parthenon, and you've got the invention of democracy, by Cleisthenes. And so we're really getting to some of what we would consider the hallmarks of Western civilization that are still going today. So in terms of the ties to the ancestors, if you will, this is the period where we're getting closer and closer and closer, and out of which will come Rome. But I have already told them there will not be a 4th book.
Leave Rome to somebody else.
I'm not going to Rome. I'm not doing Rome. Somebody else can do that.
I was really hoping you'd get to the fall of Carthage eventually, but
Yeah, that's the real collision of worlds, I suppose.
yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Professor Cline. This has been a wonderful hang this morning.
It has.
I
Thank you so
appreciate you
much.
giving us the time.
No, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
And thank you for sending us these books. You sent us 3 beautiful books. One of them's an illustrated version of this too. So, if that's the way that you want to see this, I mean, it's basically a graphic novel that illustrates all these principles. It's really incredible. I've never seen anything quite like that.
Yeah, when you said it was illustrated, I figured that there was, like a lot of plates of ancient artifacts. I did not expect a graphic novel. I was pleasantly surprised.
Yes, it is absolutely amazing. Glynis Fawkes, who drew it, she's both a cartoonist and an archaeologist. So when we got together, it was amazing. I mean, yeah, we prefer to call it a graphic history. Right, because novel sometimes implies kind of fiction and all of that, and you think, Marvel Comics and all that, but it is 1177 in graphic form, and I mean 250 pages, full color. It's gorgeous, and there's a joke on almost every page. Most of them are inside jokes, but people will get it. So it's a lot of fun, and we aimed it mostly at a new market, like kids age 7 to 17. But we also
I love the idea of explaining to a 7-year-old what the fall of civilizations is.
They're fascinated.
Yeah,
it gives them nightmares, but right. But we also hit a market we didn't expect, which is adults who don't really like to read, but like graphic novels. And I know it's getting across to them because and I know I'm not supposed to read my reviews, right? But the comments that are left, like on Amazon, but of course you have to. And one reader left a comment under the graphic version and said, "I have tried several times to get through Cline's original book. I can never get through it. But I read the graphic version in an afternoon, and now I understand what they're talking about. And my reaction is excellent, however it makes its way through to you." So I was glad. So that was good. And so, I apologize to all the kids having nightmares about the collapse of civilizations, but, there it goes. Yeah.
There's a lot of people smiling in this book.
They're having a good time.
There are. And it does feature 2 cute kids, right? Both about 12 years old, a boy and a girl. And she can read and write absolutely everything. And he's totally illiterate. So she spends the entire book making fun of him, which I think is really funny. Yeah. So, and it's also Romeo and Juliet because he's a sea person and she's Egyptian.
Ooh.
So they should be mortal enemies, but in fact, they're best friends. So that's kind of fun.
That's cute.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope we get the chance to talk again.
Yeah, that would be a pleasure. Yeah, great.
Excellent.
Thank you so much for having me on.
All right. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everybody.
We'll see you later. Bye, folks.